For the last, 50 years, the story of depression has pretty much been written one way. But what if we've been reading that story backwards? I mean, what if depression isn't the main character at all, but just a shadow cast by something else? Well, today we're diving into a really radical theory that doesn't just challenge how we see depression, it flips the whole thing completely on its head.
Okay, so here's the central, really challenging idea from the late psychiatrist Athanasios Koukopoulos. His argument is simple, but it's revolutionary. He says, mania is the cause, depression is the effect. That's it. In his view, depression doesn't just show up out of the blue. Nope. It's the inevitable crash after a manic high. And that high could even be a really subtle one that you might not even notice.
So we're going to unpack this whole provocative idea by looking at a paper that reviews his life's work. Now, the authors of this paper, they're both psychiatrists, and get this, they spent years talking with Koukopoulos himself. So their work is really our window into his controversial and honestly pretty powerful ideas.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the standard view of depression, the one Koukopoulos was pushing back against. Then, we'll dive right into his radical new theory and check out the evidence he presented. After that, things get really interesting when we explore the shocking implications for treatment, what's called the antidepressant paradox. And we'll wrap up by looking at his legacy and why he might have been a thinker way, way ahead of his time.
All right, first up, let's start with the world that Koukopoulos was trying to change. For like over half a century, psychiatry has been running on a set of core assumptions about mood disorders. A lot of this stuff is basically written in stone in the DSM, the official diagnostic manual.
So the conventional wisdom kind of splits the world in two. On one side, you've got the depressed world. This is seen as this huge, common, really profound thing. It's the main event, the primary problem. But then, way over on the other side, you have the manic world. And that's seen as small, rare, even superficial. Mania is treated as either a totally separate illness or just some uncommon symptom that pops up now and then.
And this whole way of thinking really rests on a few key beliefs. First, that depression and mania are just two totally different things. Second, that most people get what's called unipolar depression, just the depression, no mania. Third, the idea that the two almost never happen at the same time. And, there's this cultural thing too. We tend to really empathize with depression, but we stigmatize mania. We just see it as reckless or dangerous.
Okay, now let's meet the man who looked at all of this and said, nope, you've got it all backwards. Athanasios Koukopoulos. He came up with a model that just flips this entire structure right on its head, and it's all built on one core idea.
He called it the primacy of mania. And the theory is basically this. Mania is the real problem. Think of it like a fire. The energy, the agitation, the racing thoughts of mania, even a really mild form, that's the fire burning super hot. Eventually, it just burns itself out. And what's left? The ashes, the crash of depression. So in his model, you just plain don't get the depression without some kind of mania coming first.
And hey, just to show you how strange this idea sounded, even to the experts, the authors of the paper we're looking at, they admit it took them almost a decade of talking with Koukopoulos to finally wrap their heads around what he was saying. So if this feels a little counterintuitive to you right now, trust me, you are in very, very good company.
So the big question is, how did Koukopoulos even make this case? Where's the evidence for such a radical idea? Well, he built his argument piece by piece, basically by going back and looking at the very same patients that mainstream psychiatry thought it already had all figured out. Okay, so he started with the most obvious cases, classic bipolar illness. And he pointed out that in about 3/4 of these cases, the manic or hypomanic episode, that period of really high energy, it comes first. The depression follows right after. Koukopoulos said, hey, that's not a coincidence, that's cause and effect. And just that classic pattern alone, he argued, could account for about 15% of all depression. But that was just the start. Here's the biggest piece of the whole puzzle. He looked at what are called mixed states. This is where patients feel symptoms of mania and depression at the exact same time. Now, the old view said this was rare, but Koukopoulos used broader, more realistic criteria. And what did he find? That it's not rare at all. In fact, about half of all people with major depression are actually in a mixed state. Their depression is all tangled up with agitation, racing thoughts, inner tension, all classic manic symptoms. So you add that 50% on top, and boom, we're already at 65%. So what about the rest?
Well, Koukopoulos pointed to something he called affective temperaments, which is really just a fancy way of saying your underlying personality wiring. He zoomed in on what's known as the hyperthymic temperament. You know, that person who's just always on, they're super energetic, optimistic, always the life of the party. He saw that as a kind of mild, stable background mania. And his argument was that this constant state of high energy eventually just wears the system out, setting people up for a major crash into depression. He figured this could explain another 12% of cases. So now, we're up to 77%.
So let's just recap. When you add it all up, you've got the classic bipolar cycles, that huge group of people in mixed states, and then those with these high-energy temperaments. Koukopoulos' model suggests that almost 4 out of every 5 cases of depression actually have manic roots. All of a sudden, pure depression, well, it starts to look like the rare exception, not the rule. And this is where the theory gets really dramatic and frankly kind of dangerous. Because if mania is the true cause of most depression, then what on earth happens when we give millions and millions of people a treatment, antidepressants, that's designed only to treat the symptom?
What Koukopoulos argued, it creates this awful, vicious cycle. It's a paradox. Think about it. A patient has depression that's actually being caused by an underlying manic state, right? So they're given an antidepressant. But here's the problem. A lot of antidepressants can have activating, kind of manic-like side effects. So the drug ends up pouring gasoline on that hidden manic fire, making it worse. And since the mania is what's causing the depression in the first place, the depression gets worse too. The very thing that's supposed to be the cure becomes part of the problem.
And, you know, this wasn't just a theory for him. He actually put it into practice. And this next number is absolutely staggering. By the end of his career, after decades of just watching his patients, Koukopoulos gave antidepressants to only 2.7% of them. Let that sink in. He had almost completely abandoned the most common psychiatric medication on the planet because he was convinced it was doing more harm than good for most of the people he was treated.
And he had the data to back it up from his own clinic in Rome. Just look at this shift. Before he put his model into full practice, 57% of his patients were on antidepressants. After his intervention, that number plummeted to just 2.7%. At the same time, the use of mood stabilizers and other meds that actually treat mania, that skyrocketed. And here is the most important part of all. His patients got better, dramatically better. Their average depression scores fell from severe all the way down to near remission. And the risks he was talking about were incredibly serious. For example, one study from his clinic found that antidepressants had actually caused about half of all the cases of mixed depression they saw. And for those specific patients, suicide attempts were 2.5 times more frequent. For decades, he was also making the case that these drugs worsen the illness over the long haul, leading to more and more frequent mood swings, a destructive pattern that's known as rapid cycling.
So if all this is true, you're probably asking, why isn't this theory mainstream? And that leads us to the final part of his story. It's really a story about a lifetime of struggle, pushing against a profession that just wasn't ready to hear what he had to say.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows an absolutely incredible level of persistence. He first started noticing these things way back in the 1960s. He published his first major insights in 1980, and for the next 30-plus years, he just fought and fought to convince his colleagues. Even as late as 2013, when he was part of this big expert task force, he was still met with so much resistance and only managed to get some small, incremental changes made. It's really only now, after he's passed away, that his work is finally getting a serious second look.
The paper we've been looking at, it wraps up with this really powerful thought. They compare him to the philosopher Nietzsche, saying that essentially Koukopoulos was born posthumously, that when he wrote and spoke his ideas, the people who could truly understand them hadn't even been born yet. And that leaves us with one heck of a question. More than half a century after he first started talking about this, is the world of psychiatry finally ready to listen?